Paul Schrader. Paul, in a recent piece you wrote for the Los Angeles Times, you started by saying, "This is the script I swore I would have never write." What changed?
Well, I was a product of the Christian school system. Westside Christian, Grand Rapids Christian High, Calvin College. And I broke free from that world and entered the world of forbidden fruit and profane entertainment. And I thought that was that. I wrote a book of theological aesthetics when I was a young critic, but I never thought I would go back there. I was too intoxicated with the mechanisms of action and empathy and psychological realism and sex and violence. And these elements are not in the Transcendental Toolkit. And I said, I wrote about those films, I like those films, but I'll never make one myself. And then about 3 years ago, I was giving an award to Pavel Pawlowski at the New York Society of Film Critics for his film Ida, about the Polish nuns. And he had read my book, and I had liked his film, and we got to talking. And I had to walk the 9 blocks uptown to my condo in Chelsea. And on the way up, I said, it's time. You're going to be 70 next year. It's time to write that film you swore you would never write, to write that spiritual film. And once I made that intellectual decision, everything followed rather quickly, because it was a place that I had refused to go all my life. But I stepped across the Rubicon, and then boom, I was flooded with ideas. And so that's how it began. Yeah, and yeah, that's that.
But what I said before, as I said before, when you made my brief introduction for the film, what I love about this is how it ties in your passion for Bergman, for Bresson, for Dreyer, your concern about spiritual life with very, very contemporary issue, the environment, the role of the church. So how that gel together, that combination between past and present.
Mankind has been having a theoretical discussion for thousands of years. Why are we here? Where are we going? This was always a theoretical discussion. You would have it, your grandchildren would have it, their grandchildren would have it. It would never get answered. Well, now we stand at this unique moment in history where, in fact, the question is not so theoretical anymore. It's maybe, in fact, existential. We may be looking at the end of our species in the course of this century. I don't say that with hyperbole. I say that with a kind of factual conviction. And so, all of a sudden these questions take on a weight, and they take on a kind of dire craziness. And in particular in Christianity, which is so saturated with blood, like the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, that once people start getting a little bit crazy, they start making these fallacious connections between their own sacrifice and the sacrifice of Christ. And if I can suffer enough, I will equal the suffering that has atoned me. Now, this is jihadism, pure and simple. But for a man, a spiritual man like Reverend Toller, caught in this vice of despair, what It's the sickness unto death, as Kierkegaard called it, angst. You know, a man trapped in that device, the temptation of the pathology of suicidal glory is very strong and very, of course, evil. And so that's sort of where we end up in this.
You've said in the past that this film also has a very strong connection with Taxi Driver. In what sense?
Well, Taxi Driver is the first script I wrote, and it's very much a young man's film. And it's full of the anger of a young man and the striking out. And also it's full of the pathology of suicidal glory, that if I suffer enough, I will earn my own redemption. And which, as I just said, is a mortal sin. And I circled back around this over the years, Mishima, Light Sleeper, American Gigolo, The Walker. But I came back around to it again this time. And I didn't realize how infused this film was going to be with Taxi Driver. Because I had taken the main character from Diary of a Country Priest, I'd taken the milieu from Winter Light, taken the elevation scene from Tarkovsky, taken the ending from a film by Carl Dreyer called Ordette. But what I didn't realize is how deeply I had wrapped all of these things in the pathology of Travis Bickle.
Travis Bickle being Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver.
And I'm in the editing room, and the editor says to me, you know, there's a lot of Taxi Driver in this film. I said, yeah, I know, I put it in there. And he said, no. There's not a little. He said, there is a lot. And I started thinking about it and realized how infused this was. Because I had set out when I made this film to do a slow movie. A movie of measured paces. No camera movement, no pans, no tilts, no music. And when I first screened it, I said, you know, this is a very, very slow movie. Just relax. Don't put any pressure on it. It will come to you. And afterwards, someone said, you know, this is not a slow movie at all. And I realized what had kept it from being slow was that monomaniacal obsession with this notion of self-transformation. And that had just seeped into the core of this film.
Another thing I like, and it pertains to what you're just talking about, is the way you draw the audience inside his mind. We sort of we start to see the world through his eye. So what he does becomes not maybe natural but plausible.
It's a gimmick, and I stumbled upon the gimmick in Taxi Driver, which is you have a monocular view of society. One eye closed, the other eye a tube. You only see what the main character sees. If he doesn't see it, you don't see it. So you're locked into his visual mindset. Now you're also hearing his thoughts and his diary. And those thoughts are coming into your veins like intravenous feeding. They're just seeping into you. There's no you can't even taste them, but you feel them. So now you're looking at the world through this one point of view. You're being filled up with this character's feelings. And sooner or later, you're going to start to identify. And I judge that moment at about 45 minutes. If you can pull this game off for 45 minutes, just so burrow the viewer into a private view of life, that there is no other view of life. No other person exists. Only Reverend Toller exists. You know, yeah, that girl is pretty interesting, but we don't really want to know about her. All we care about is me, Reverend Toller. And you get sucked into him, and you start to think he's normal. And then you start to break off a little bit, little by little. So you break off, and you start to diverge. And you wonder, how far will the audience go with me as this character becomes less and less worthy of their identification? Because they've now identified with him. They've committed the better part of an hour to identifying with him. And they want to know how this is going to turn out. And so you got them. And if you just sort of sweep away from the world of logic, you can start to take them into places, them meaning you, the audience. You could take them into places where they're not very comfortable. And once that happens, wonderful things happen. You know, once you open the door a crack to mystery of the audience volunteering and being uncomfortable and having to create a new plan to justify their lack, you know, they're identifying with a character they don't care for anymore. And how do they deal with that, you know? Do they distance themselves, or do they create an artifact? I, as a filmmaker and an artist and a writer, can't tell you that. But that's what makes it work, because you each will come up with your own kind of justification for why I'm still here in the theater. And my only job is to keep you in the theater. Your job is to figure out why you're still here.
Is it true that you asked Ethan to write the diaries, right? He wrote the entries?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you're shooting, you have all these diaries. So I gave him a dozen notebooks and told him to fill them all out to various degrees. And, you know, it was good discipline for him, because he could actually write and rewrite the internal thoughts of his character. And, you know, he found that very useful.
And how much, can you describe a little bit your collaboration in the creation of those internal thoughts?
Well, Ethan is not like this guy. He's not like Reverend Toller. Ethan is an Austin hippie. He's a goofball. You know, you've seen that in his other films. He's kind of a goofy guy. But I sense that because his physiognomy was right, and because he had a history of spiritual pursuits, he in fact had spent 2 sabbaticals at the Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky, where Thomas Merton lived. And his ex-father-in-law was a foremost scholar of Asian religion, and his father was a deacon. So he had these pursuits. And I sensed about him that if he stopped giving, he could be very interesting. And I said to him the first time we met, I said, do you know what a recessive performance is? He said, yeah. So I said, okay, when you're speaking, if you can sense the viewer interested in what you have to say, lean back. And if they're still interested, just lean back a little more. Just keep leaning away from their interest. Do nothing to ingratiate yourself. Do nothing to satisfy them. And see how long they can stay interested. And this is a withholding technique. And it's the same kind of withholding technique that you use throughout a film such as this. You use it in terms of camera movement, you use it in terms of editing, you use it in terms of music, you terms in acting and wardrobe and production design. And I think one of the best examples of what a withholding technique is the delayed cut. Okay, the first time I ever saw a delayed cut was in a film by Bresson. Now, normally in a film, let's say this is a doorway. A man enters, a man exits. You splice on action. The door opens, the door closes. Bresson, in Country Piece, Pickpocket, Man Escaped, he would hold that door and the man would leave the door. The door would close and then he would go 1, 2, 3, and then he would cut. Now, your eye does not do that. Your eye does not stay watching a closed door after someone leaves the room. Your eye instantly finds something more interesting. But now you're in a movie, and the director is not cutting. He's just looking at that door. And what are you going to do? Well, you're going to be looking at that door too. Now, what happens for these 3 seconds that you're looking at the door? Or what happens to these 5 seconds? What happens to these 10 seconds where you're looking at the door? You can say nothing is happening, but that's not true. Something is happening. What's happening is time. Time is acting upon the image. And watching that door for 3 seconds is not the same as watching it for 5 or watching it for 10. And the concept of duration, what happens when duration acts upon an image, is part and parcel of the whole notion of how to create a spiritual style, because it starts to simulate meditation. There is no such thing as fast meditation, and there is no such thing as fast spiritual style, and you have to slow people down, and you have to let duration act upon them, because good things happen while you wait.
It would seem counterintuitive to everything that we look at. There is no attention span left. What you're saying, and which I totally subscribe to, it seems completely the opposite. What's going on is the opposite that films are made today. So I'm wondering how difficult was for you to get this film made, and for you not to transgress this style.
Yeah, I mean, when you work in this way, you work against the very grain of what cinema is best at. Cinema is best at action and empathy. Empathy, I show you an object, you empathize. Then that object moves and you have action and empathy. Now when you start saying, no, the object's not going to move. So you're cutting against the very grain of what makes cinema attractive. And as a result, you're going to lose people. But there is another dance that you can do that retains them. And I've used the phrase, the scalpel of boredom. How do you use the scalpel of boredom to get somebody interested in what you're doing? Because if I use the scalpel of boredom appropriately, you will still stay in the theater, but you will start to have a response that you're not planning on. And that's the sort of trick of this. Now, this particular film, how did I get it made? I wrote it, I sent it to Ethan. He got in touch with me the next day. The film economics have changed. This film would not have been financially viable when I began, or even 20 years ago. It would have been a 40, 45-day film. I made this film in 20 days. At that price point, it was a valid investment. I could go to whomever and say, this is a valid way to spend your money. you will get your money back. And I've said that in the past, but when I said it, I was lying. Now I can say it and say, it's the truth. You will get your money back. And so one of the good things about the enormous drop in the cost of filmmaking is that films like this are now economically feasible. The bad thing, and so as a result, virtually anybody can make a movie now, and they are. The bad thing is that nobody can make a living at it.
Something I want to add to what Paul is saying is that what's quite remarkable is that for his past few films, he has worked with an extremely young crew. I mean, he seeks them out on the internet and is really open to young collaborators. So, you know, besides being a question of cost, you also feel the energy and I just love the relationship between him and his DP and the editor. They all come from the world of the way, you know, for the web.
Yeah, I did the film before this film called Dog Eat Dog, which was completely vulgar, profane, and blasphemous. A kind of Tarantino-esque relishment in bad behavior. And so I was thinking, you know, I did it with Nick Cage and Willem Dafoe. I said, you know, how can I make a gangster film in 2016 relevant after Scorsese, after Tarantino, after Michael Ritchie? And so I put together this crew of people, none of whom had film credits before. They came from fashion, video games, commercials. And I gave them each their first major credit. And we met every week for a summer. And I just said, look, I'm getting final cut on this movie. I can do any goddamn thing I want. All I want you to do is come every single week and throw some crazy idea at me. You know, maybe all the men should wear green hats. Okay, I'll listen to that idea. Any idea you have, I'll listen to it. Let's just open up our minds. And so that's how I did that particular film, and I found it enormously invigorating just to, because I wasn't looking for kids who wanted to think outside the box. I was looking for kids who didn't know there was a box.
And a lot of the people that have watched this film and loved it, there is always a conversation about the end. So can you talk a little bit about what you wanted to do with it? Why did you?
You know, it is open-ended. Some years on, after Taxi Driver, some people started to say that the ending of Taxi Driver was a fantasy, and it wasn't planned to be that way, but I thought, oh, you know, I'm all right with that interpretation. And so I came to this one. I said, well, you know, maybe I should bake in that interpretation. So there's two ways to read the ending, which was a miracle has occurred, this woman has saved his life. And the other one is that it's an ecstatic vision post-mortem. And my original version of the script, he just dies and falls out of frame. And then I decided to go to the Carl Dreyer Ordette ending, which is a cardinal response to a miracle. In that film, a woman is raised from the dead, and her husband, his only response to seeing a miracle is pure carnal desire. I said, yes, that should be the response to the miraculous, carnality, the proper response. So then I went that way. And when we would preview the film, I would ask, you know, who thinks he's alive, who thinks he's dead. And it would usually be about 50-50, which was where I was headed. I wanted to keep it at 50-50. So I, changed the film slightly to keep it in 50-50. But my current interpretation of the end of the film is that Reverend Toller stands there in his own Garden of Gethsemane with his own cup, and the Lord doesn't take it from him, and he drinks it. And he falls to all fours, and he starts purging out his insides. And God walks in the room. God, who has not spoken to him throughout the course of this whole film. He walks in the room, and he walks over to him, and he says, Reverend Toller, would you like to see what heaven looks like? I'm going to show you right now. Heaven looks like one long kiss. And that's the last thing he sees. I like that ending too.
I could go on all night, but I'm sure some of you have also questions, so raise your hand so that I don't monopolize the conversation. Question? Ricky.
I've seen the film now twice. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Ricky, I certainly thank you very much. I've seen the film twice now. I think it's absolutely brilliant, a gift. I'm looking forward to seeing it a few more times. And I was one of the people who said to Giulia, the ending is something I haven't worked through. And the second viewing, it was almost the Passion of Christ, something very similar to what you were saying, meeting the corporal desire with the martyrdom, and I thought it was just absolutely brilliant. The selection of the song, and I have not been raised in the Christian tradition, when she started singing when Toller doesn't show up, the first thing I thought of was Night of the Hunter.
Yeah, I mean, it is in Night of the Hunter. When I was a kid, I went to the Billy Graham Crusades. Went up and made profession of faith. And George Beverly Shea was Billy Graham's primary singer. Great, great voice. And this was one of his standards, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. And I remember as a kid seeing my father sit in the darkened living room, listening to George Beverly Shea sing Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. So that's where it came from. Also, the perversity of this man in barbed wire embracing this hot young chick while the woman who really loves him is talking about the everlasting arms. It's so kind of icky cool.
Was there someone over here?
Oh. It's dark. I want to interject to something that Ricky said, and since Ricky mentioned Christianity, do you think it's a role of the church to help on the environment?
Oh, absolutely, and so do there's a mistaken notion. I come from a very rich humanitarian Christian tradition. And I've taken this film around, and I've lectured at Calvin, my alma mater, Fuller Theological, Yale Divinity, St. Olaf's, Notre Dame. And, there is a rich body of Christian humanism. Unfortunately, they get shouted out by the hateful, angry people. And you start to think that the Franklin Grahams or the Liberty College people are somehow representative of Christianity, which is really sad. And one of the things I noticed when I was speaking at various seminaries is that you run into professors and theologians become associated with this kind of craziness. But it did. And it's happened not only to them, it's happened to all of America. And the mission of stewardship is a mighty mission of the church. And but then there is that kind of perverse side that says, and I've heard this said, that's why I put it in the script, what if this is God's plan? What if God really wants to destroy the world? What if carbon life forms are just a way station in the history of God's intelligence?
You studied theology. Did you ever actually think of becoming a priest when you were young?
Well, it wouldn't be a priest, it would be a reverend.
A reverend, so I'm Catholic.
In order to graduate from Calvin, Calvin was a seminary. So everyone minored in theology. I took 6 hours of Calvin's Institutes. So you minored in theology, and then when you graduated, you could either move on to the seminary or you could move elsewhere. So that was the... And my father was a thwarted minister. He had wanted to be a minister, and the Depression came along, and he couldn't do it, and so he had raised his boys to, fill those shoes.
Thank you so much for your work. If you can do that in 20 days, we look forward to what you do this year. Could you tell us a little bit about the moment when she asks him to lie down, or she wants to lie down on him, and they float off, and the overview of the world's disasters after that?
Yeah.
Was that spontaneous?
I knew at the end of the film I had to move beyond the material world. Because there is another world running right alongside us. And sometimes you could almost reach out and touch it. And it's the non-material world. And I said, we are going to end up in the non-material world at the end. I should foreshadow this. How can I foreshadow it? And I literally remember sitting at my desk thinking to myself, what would Tarkovsky do? And Andrei Tarkovsky, a Russian film director, loved to levitate. He did it in Mirror, he did it in Sacrifice. You get two people horizontal in a Tarkovsky film, they just start moving up. I said, well, if it's good enough for Tarkovsky, it's good enough for me. But then I changed it so that the levitation, which begins as an Edenic experience, the first panel of Bosch's Garden of Heavenly Delights. So it begins in Eden and moves into our world and then moves into the underworld. And that this man, Reverend Toller, is so committed to his own despair that he takes this revelatory moment of otherworldliness and pollutes it. And that moves us towards, the ending of the film.
At the beginning of the film, you have Reverend Toller defining wisdom as the ability to keep hope and despair in the mind simultaneously, which is a marvelous idea. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that at all.
Well, Albert Camus once famously said, I don't believe, I choose to believe. We are now at a moment in human history where there is no justification for hope. But we can still choose to hope. And maybe that's the only choice we have, because how else do you live but to choose hope? So that's what Reverend Toller is saying. You have to, in the depths of your despair, you have to be able to choose hope at the same time and let them coexist, because there is no other choice.
And
Thank you for the film. I really loved it. And I'm a big Merton fan, so seeing those kinds of references was especially moving to me. I just have one question: is why did you choose to have him be dying, physically dying? What if he wasn't? It's just one.
Well, I'm not quite how sure he is dying. He never. I cut a scene out of the film where he went back to have the cancer exam and didn't just walk out of the room and decided not to have it because he was too committed to dying to actually find out whether he was dying. And, you know, that's also part of Diary of a Country Priest, where the Braconian priest has stomach cancer and is using wine and bread as a perversion of the sacrament to sort of deal with his stomach cancer. It was the same thing our character does. But here's something interesting. Okay, so this guy has this sickness. He's sick, the Kierkegaardian sickness. Now, the church teaches us, St. Augustine teaches us, that suicide is a sin. It deprives God of his prerogative. Suicide is a sin. But Samson was not a sinner. Samson was a martyr. So now you have the suicidal reverend on a death trip, trying to get out of it, but he's going to write a diary for 1 year. He's using the alcohol, he's using the liturgy, he's using the vestments, he's using the poses of prayer to get out of this despair. But he can't get out of it. And he is nothing more than a selfish, suicidal minister. And then this boy comes into his life, and the boy kills himself like his son, and he catches the boy's virus. And that mantle that the boy was wearing, he wraps himself up in it. He is no longer a suicidal reverend. He is now a martyr in waiting. He is one of God's chosen, he is one of God's called, and he will now die and be elevated into glory, just like Samson. Now, this is evil. This is pathology. You understand? This is not good thinking. This is bad thinking. But the temptation toward the pathology of suicidal glory is mighty in the Christian religions. And the temptation for him to wrap himself in this justification of death rather than admit that he's a no-count sinner, you know. That's part of what's going on, and it's part of the thing the viewer is being sucked into. You know, is he really an ecological warrior? Does he really believe these things? Or is he just using this to justify the trip he's on? I don't know.
Okay, we have time for one more, and then Peter.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is that I think Bresson would have genuflected over this film. And it's not just the stylistic elements. You shrunk the frame, the delayed cuts. I think that's really exquisite writing. And I think, although he didn't really achieve that, I think he would have appreciated how you did what Ethan Hawke in this, what you did with Jeff Goldblum in Adam Resurrected. In the case of Goldblum, you showed people how much more he could do, and it was astonishing. And with Ethan Hawke, you showed how much less he could do, and it was still astonishing. And I think Bresson would have appreciated that. But here's my question, and I have to just set a foundation for the question. I sort of posit two Paul Schraders. You conducted an interview with Scorsese for Cahiers de Cinema, and it's really a gem. I would love to get rights to it and film it as a short. But the highlight is at a point where you say to Scorsese, you know, I was in Montreux and I bought 3 Stations of the Cross and hung them in my home so that I have to pass them when I stagger up the steps drunk in the middle of the night. Whatever that means, that's a guy who was seriously engaged with his religious background. And as Giulia said at the beginning of the screening, you wrote this book when you were 25, The Transcendental Style in Film, and still involved in it. You wrote a wonderful preface for the paperback last year. So still involved in transcendental style, in slow style, as you describe it. I thought before I saw the film that my question was going to be, which of the Paul Schraders, the guy who had the Stations of the Cross in his house, or the guy who was fascinated by Bresson and Dreyer and so forth, made that decision as you were walking up to Chelsea to make this movie? Now my question is different, though. I'm just wondering whether you needed to wait this long, before you could make this film.
I think so. I don't think a young man could make this film. A young man could make Taxi Driver, but I don't think a young man could make this film. This film gets made after you pass through the curtain of I don't give a fuck. And I passed through that curtain. And, it's very, very, if I had tried to make this film earlier, I would have been so terrified by the financial consequences of failure. You fail making a film like this, and we don't have subsidies in this country, so you really do fail, and your career is blighted. And so, but now I've reached a point where I don't care. I don't care. It's interesting. Tuesday, they're going to announce the nominations for the Oscars. Some prognosticators think that Ethan and I will be nominated. Some think we won't. I personally think we won't, but who knows? But how did I ever come to care about such a thing? The middle-brow taste of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences? I really don't care, And so when I don't get nominated on Tuesday, it will be a disappointment and a relief.
But you do care enormously about this film, because I remember when you made it, and I remember when I wanted to show it, and you were so worried, you were so concerned that people wouldn't embrace it. It's a film that is extremely dear to you. You can't deny. It's not true that you don't give a fuck. It's just not true.
I mean, I didn't. I was caught a little unawares by the impact of the film, because you always say, "Look, I'm glad critics like my movie, but if they didn't, it's still a good movie," and you believe this. But still, it's very nice when they do.
And with this, I thank Paul Schrader and you all for coming.